Welcome and thank you for joining us for another edition of Local Matters. On this week's broadcast, we bring a special episode about the mystery of the Shroud of Turin with our sister station WSFI Spotlight. Though WQPH visited the Shroud of Turin on one of our many Italian pilgrimages. Hosts AJ Shaw and John Breen interviews Russ, Breault, a Catholic speaker and author of The Shroud Encounter. He talks all about the Shroud of Turin and much more. To learn more about Russ's work, visit shroudencounter.com, and to learn more of the Shroud of Turin, visit shroud.com. This is the conclusion of this series. A special thank you to Angela Tomlinson for producing this episode. To learn more about our sister station, WSFI, visit WSFICatholicRadio.org.
This is WSFI Spotlight, a conversation with Catholics living in the light.
Our guest today is Russ Breault, who has spent the last 30 years as a researcher looking into the Shroud of Turin, which is the linen cloth believed by millions to be the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, though he's done this through several in-person experiences and educational resources. And as I mentioned, he's been presenting this to hundreds of audiences over the past 30 years. I am AJ Shaw, your host today. I'm joined by John Breen, who is my co-host. Mr. Breault, thank you so much for your time.
Well, my pleasure to be here, AJ. John?
Growing up, I knew about the Shroud of Turin. I had this question in my mind, I think a lot of other Catholics do, where I think the closest comparison that they make with the Shroud of Turin is the true cross that Christ was crucified on. Most of us know the story of how the recovered crucifix, the cross, was authenticated, and that was through miracles. So if you were to draw a comparison, say, for the Shroud of Turin versus the cross, which has been thoroughly authenticated through numerous miracles, a lot of people would point out and say, well, where's the miracle in connection to the Shroud of Turin, But I kind of wonder, though, and I just kind of want to bounce this off of you, is perhaps the miracle is in its own preservation over 2,000 years.
Well, from a physical miracle, yeah, I do think that may be a possibility. I don't want to discount the fact that it's made out of flax, which is a very durable material. It's made of a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave. It's a complex weave, doable in first century, but it's expensive. But it also has a lot of strength and durability. So even just the materials and the manufacture of the cloth have aided in its preservation. But when it comes to miracles, I get this question from time to time. There are millions of miracles associated with the Shroud.
Okay.
They are miracles of faith. I tell people all the time, you've all heard the expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. The Shroud takes you right up to the water's edge, but, and nothing else does that. But it's not going to take you past the water. You're still going to have to make a decision for yourself as to who Jesus is, because he's not in that Shroud anymore. All the time, when I do presentations, and I do them all the time, I'm always hoping for the doubting Thomas. You see, because the whole doubting Thomas story is really important. Is because here you know the story. Jesus had already risen, and all the apostles were huddled in the upper room, and they had the doors locked and the windows shut, and they were freaked out. They just killed Jesus. They think they're next. And all of a sudden, just Jesus appears in their midst, and the first thing they wanted to do was to touch him, make sure he was physical and not some ghost or apparition, right? Then the second thing, he broke bread with them, and then the third thing, he talked about the kingdom, probably for hours, and then Jesus leaves the same way he came, poof, gone. Now later that night, maybe the following day, we don't really know. Thomas. He wasn't there. He decides to come back. Can you imagine how the chemistry in that room had completely changed? Everyone runs up to Thomas and says, Thomas, it's true. He is alive. He was here. We touched him. He broke bread with us. He talked about the kingdom. where were you? And then Thomas probably folds his arms and says, no, 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 I can't believe. I won't. Not until I thrust my hand into his side and place my fingers into his nail wounds. And then a week later, Jesus, and so forever, he's forever known now as Doubting Thomas. And so a week later, Jesus appears again in the upper room. This time Thomas is there, and the first person Jesus speaks to is Thomas. And Thomas, no doubt, falls at Jesus' feet. And then Jesus quotes his own words back to him and says, Thomas, thrust your hand into my side and place your fingers into my nail wounds, and be not faithless, but believe. And at this point, forever known as Doubting Thomas, now makes the strongest profession of faith in the entire New Testament. He says, my Lord and my God. But he couldn't do it, wouldn't do it, or was unable to do it until he was face to face with the resurrected Christ for himself. That's the point. That's the whole message of the Shroud. That's why it exists, for the Doubting Thomases of our age and really every age. I think the Shroud exists as an act of God's grace and his mercy to give pretty much anyone in the world the same opportunity he gave to Thomas. And so there are millions of miracles of faith where people have been presented. You see, because the Shroud presents you the entire gospel message. It's all there. The life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That is the gospel, and so there. That would be my answer to the question on miracles.
What is your view on some of the alternative hypotheses? You mentioned a little bit earlier about artistry, but also some of the natural chemical reactions.
Well, there's been a lot of experiments on the Shroud to try to figure out how this image came to be. Naturalistic explanations just don't do it. For instance, if you were to think that the cloth was wrapped the body of Jesus in oils and aloes and sweats and things soaked into the cloth, and that somehow did it. No, it's not going to do it. Is because it's uniform in intensity, top to bottom, front to back. There's no variations in density of the image. It's unbelievable uniform. I mean, it's almost like you need a piece of technology to fabricate something like the Shroud. Notions of the body being wrapped in this cloth with the emanation of some of the early stages of decay, such as ammonia gases emitting from the body, interacting with the cloth. The only problem with that, anything with the gases are gonna first concentrate on any of your natural orifices, your nose, your mouth, your ears, and other orifices, and so it's going to be inconsistent. You're not going to have the consistent emanation of those type of gases. So there really isn't a naturalistic explanation that satisfies all the criteria that we see on the Shroud. And it's now the one that I like the best, but unfortunately for the materialist of the world, it invokes a supernatural cause. But they did they did some experiments with the ENEA. This is a European agency for new technologies. They wrote this up in a peer-reviewed journal in 2011, been experimenting with these high-power excimer lasers, and they determined that a 40 nanosecond burst on a UV laser against a control sample of linen achieves the very same depth and coloration as we see on the Shroud. Very superficial, penetrating only a couple microfibers deep, and the same coloration. And I'm saying, now that's cool. Is because the best explanation for what happened to Jesus in the tomb probably comes from the Apostle Paul, who writes in 1 Corinthians 15. I think it's 50 and 51. He says, "Behold, I show you a mystery. we will not all sleep. That means to remain dead, but we will all be changed in the twinkling of an eye. For when at the end of the age there'll be the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will all be changed. So Paul is talking about this instantaneous transformational event that occurs at the end of the age, and he's saying it in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye. And I'm saying that sounds a lot like a 40 nanosecond burst on a UV laser.
Yeah.
And so I am into if you just do a straight Bible study, you know that light is involved in the resurrection.
All right, we'll come right back to that here after this quick break.
We invite you now to join us in prayer as Juliana Tamarazi, founder and president of the Iraqi Christian Relief Council, prays the Our Father in Aramaic, the language spoken by Christ.
بشم البابا وبرونا وروح القدس آمين. آمد بشمية نتقدى شماخ تيتم الكوتاخ نوى سوياناخ إيكنا دشمية أبرأ هولان لخمة سمقانا يومانا وشوقلن خوبين إيكنا داوختنان شواقن خياوي لا تالن نسيونا إلا بصن من بيشا مدودي لخي ملكوتا خيلو تشبخت الألم المين وامين بشمت بابا وبرونا وروخة قدشة آمين.
This is WSFI Spotlight, a conversation with Catholics living in the light.
Our conversation continues with Russ Breault. I'm A.J. Shaw. John Breen is my co-host as we continue our conversation with Russ about the Shroud of Turin. I was going to start off this next segment by asking you, Russ, about the 1988 radiocarbon dating of the Shroud that placed it in the medieval period. How do you respond to that?
Well, the 1988 carbon dating test is probably, once it's all revealed, is going to go down as one of the greatest scientific debacles. They were supposed to cut 3 different samples from 3 different locations on the Shroud. Mm-hmm. They didn't do that. They took 1 sample from the outside corner edge, exactly where it had been held and handled hundreds of times over the centuries. Now we have to understand this. This is a long cloth, 14 feet long. When it was exhibited in centuries past, you would have multiple people literally standing on a platform, holding it with their hands, hand holding this cloth up for, horizontally, stretching 14 feet, so that the people down below could view and venerate this cloth. And it was be held up for hours. Multiple people would come. Not one person would hold it the whole time. They'd come, change different people, because after all, who wouldn't want an opportunity to hold the Breault shroud that wrapped Jesus in the tomb? So you have multiple top people holding it, and we know that the shroud was exhibited that way over 275 times from 1413 until 1694, when it was finally installed into the cathedral where it's at. So if you were looking for the worst possible sample location, you would cut from one of the 2 outside corners that had been held and handled all those times, and of course that's what they did. And so now enter Ray Rogers, is a thermal chemist with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He begins to suspect that there may be something awry with that corner, looking at some of the spectrographic data. And so he obtains a thread sample. Now, when they cut the sample, they had 3 little postage stamp size samples. They sent that off to the labs. And then they had a larger sample that was held back, and that was called the reserve sample. Well, he obtained a thread from the middle of the reserve sample and compared it chemically with a thread from the main body of the shroud. And lo and behold, they're not the same. And so he publishes this in a peer-reviewed journal in 2005, and he finds cotton mixed in with the threads, with the flax, in that corner, but there's no cotton anywhere else on the shroud. He finds a madder root dye, some kind of a dye to blend in the newer cotton threads in that corner, but there's no dye anywhere else on the shroud. And he finds the presence of starch to stiffen the threads to effect some kind of repair. And he also sees a clear splice where the cotton and the flax are spliced into each other. So in other words, we have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval reweave or medieval repair. And so by only taking one sample from the worst possible location, we have nothing else to compare it with. And so many of us, including me, think, I don't think we even know what we dated. And so now enter some of the latest technology. This was published a couple years ago. It's called wide-angle X-ray scattering. It's a whole new technology that measures the amount of natural aging in various fibers. And they determined that there's far more aging in fibers from the shroud for it only to be 700 years, as the carbon labs say. In fact, the amount of natural aging found in fibers from the shroud best correlates with fabric that they excavated from Masada, Israel, circa 1st century. And so now who's right and who's wrong? And it's so they totally failed the established protocol, and we wouldn't even been having this question right now had they followed instructions. As I say in my presentations, 5th graders know that cutting one sample into 3 pieces is not the same as taking 3 different samples. And it's but I guess apparently they didn't know that. And it's so the as far as carbon dating is concerned, I would have to render it inconclusive because they botched the sampling. But the wide-angle X-ray scattering, poses a different alternative that puts it right at 1st century.
Do you think proving that the shroud is authentic, do you think it might change how we view modern faith?
Well, first of all, I don't think we can ever prove it to be authentic. Because, as I said before, we don't have the DNA of Jesus to match it up with something we might extract from the shroud. Sure. The more information we find that is supportive, that certainly builds a stronger case. But it depends on what your burden of proof is, and that really goes down to the individual. So for instance, I think we could clearly say that there's 2 different levels of proof in a civil trial versus a criminal trial. In a civil trial, it's the preponderance of evidence. In a criminal trial, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So I think we're already at the preponderance of evidence would indicate that the shroud is authentic. Now, it's going to vary from person to person as to whether they think the evidence rises to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's up to the individual. It's just like all of us being members of a jury, and we're all going to have to make a decision on our own. And I kind of think that's the way God wants it.
Yeah.
I think we have a God who specializes in mystery. He really everything about God is a mystery. How do you explain how do you feed 5,000 people with a boy's lunch? We call it a miracle, but it's a mystery, and it's a mystery beyond the realm of physics. Physics is never going to answer that question. It's that's it. That's going to be a question of faith. Did Jesus really do that? We had all these eyewitnesses that said he did, but if you're a materialist and you're coming from the view that that this is all there is and there ain't no more, and you believe we evolved from a random process, well, then the shroud could never be authentic, not for you. And so it depends on where you're coming from. I think that evidence can be persuasive. I think I've witnessed many times people walking into. In fact, I'll give you this one. I used to be on a regular lecture circuit for the U.S. Army chaplaincy, and went all over the country, and even spent a week in Hawaii. and it's used to speak at the infantry training brigades down at Fort Benning in Georgia, and so I was one of these training, all young guys, coming in their early late teens, early 20s, and coming into this big classroom with M16s on their laps, and I'm saying, boy, I better do a good job or I'm in trouble. It's and so afterwards, this young recruit came up to me, and he said this to me. He said, I just want you to know, I was an atheist when I walked in here, but this thing scared the hell out of me. And I said, well, that's a good thing. So the Shroud has an impact. You don't go to a Shroud encounter or a Shroud presentation, or it stays with you. And you may not convert and, on the moment, on the spot, but it's going to stay with you, and it's going to it's going to have an impact on you sooner or later. And it's so I think I think evidence is important. That's the whole field of apologetics, isn't it? It's
True.
It's using evidence to kind of to make a rational defense for the faith. There's nothing wrong with that. Chances are you won't argue someone into the faith, but at least you'll make them think. And it's, so.
What do you wish more skeptics understood about your position?
Well, I'm not dogmatic about this. I just say, listen, explore the mystery, encounter their message. It's as simple as that. Come and hear what there is to be known about this incredible artifact, most likely a relic, it's the most analyzed artifact in the world, and how can it possibly remain a mystery after all this? And come and see, explore with me, and as you do, what are you doing? You can't talk about the Shroud without talking about Jesus. And so you really can't dance around the issue. The one thing that sets the Shroud apart from pretty much anything is the fact that, let's be skeptical for a minute. Well, how do you know that's the bones of Saint so-and-so? I mean, come on, how do you know? I mean, you say it is, and you have the church tradition says it is, but how do you know? And it's, but you see, with the Shroud, you have a 14-foot-long linen cloth etched with the faint, image of a bearded crucified man with pattern of bloodstains all over it. This rises to the level of Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, it is light years, head and shoulders above anything else. And the fact that it is so uniquely testable makes it so profound.
Isn't it an interesting point, though? If I'm going off of memory here, isn't there a lance mark in the side? And would that be consistent with Scripture that, because typically the custom was with crucifixion, they would break the legs.
Correct.
As a follow-up before taking the body down. But in his case, since they saw he was already dead, the soldier pierced the side. If I remember correctly, isn't that scene on the Shroud where you could see where there is a laceration on the side?
Yeah. You can see the wound, and you also see the blood flowing down from the wound, and there's also a clear separation of blood and blood serum, which indicates that this is a post-mortem blood flow. So in other words, you don't get the separation of blood and blood serum unless the heart is no longer beating and the blood is no longer circulating, and then if it sets up, if you take a vial of blood and set it on a shelf, you come back 30 minutes later, it's separated, and you have the clear plasma rises to the top. And so that's what John saw when the spear came in, outflowed blood and water. It's probably blood and blood serum. Yeah, so even that's true. Yeah, that
would be a definitive, that would point in the direction that more likely than not this could be nothing less than authentic.
Well, if you're looking for an identification, there is no mistaken identity. This is absolutely the burial shroud of Jesus from that standpoint. Because first of all, 30 puncture wounds around the head. No one gets a crown of thorns as a routine of crucifixion. It was a mockery for the man who claimed to be king of the Jews.
Right.
And then, as you said, they didn't break his legs. Instead, they stabbed him in the side. Also, he was massively scourged, whipped. Why did they do that? Because usually you were either whipped and released as a form of punishment, or you were crucified to be executed. Rarely would you be scourged and crucified, because remember, the Romans were a brutal bunch.
Yes.
If they wanted you to die quickly, they just cut your head off.
Yep.
So they wanted you to stay alive as long as possible while you were dying. Imagine that.
Maximum
And
pain.
so,
Yes.
so the question is why was Jesus so badly scourged? Because Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, didn't think Jesus was guilty of a crime worthy of capital punishment. He didn't want to kill him. And the first thing he did, he sent him to King Herod, and Herod sent him back. And then he tried to trade Barabbas, and that didn't work. And so finally he has him scourged to within an inch of his life, hoping that when this bloodied hulk of a man came walking back into the courtyard, maybe they'd say, okay, that's enough. You don't have to kill him. But that's not what happened, is it? In spite of being brutally scourged, they still wanted him dead. So when you add all that up, and then you have the extreme anomaly of a man who died by crucifixion, a criminal's death, and yet wrapped in a rich man's shroud, this doesn't happen. In fact, most people who are crucified are thrown into a common grave. So you have an individual burial wrapped in a rich man's shroud. In fact, it's even a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Isaiah 53:9 says that he was assigned a grave with the wicked and the rich in his death. How do you do that? Crucifixion, criminal's death, in between two thieves, wrapped in a rich man's shroud, placed in a rich man's tomb.
Wow.
And again, thanks so much to Russ Breault for his time today. How should people approach the shroud? Should they look at it scientifically, spiritually, or both?
However God leads you. Some people need it from a scientific perspective. It's there for you. Some people want to look at it historically. It's there for you. Some people want to look at it devotionally, spiritually. It's there for you. Whatever speaks to you, because people come at it from different perspectives, and it's but I do believe it is really a gospel written on linen. It has no need to be translated. It speaks every language, and it also reaches every level. In other words, a 5-year-old who can't even read can say, "Look, mommy, look, daddy, there's Jesus." A teenager can get all caught up in the science and say, "Man, this is really cool." But then the academic, the intellectual, can take all the theology and the history and the science as deep as they want to go. And so it really does speak to every level. And it's in my opinion, there's no one who cannot be impacted by the shroud.
Well, Russ, we really appreciate your time today coming on and joining us on WSFI. John, thank you so much for your help with the questions and on the board. And thank you so much once again, sir, for the conversation. This was a really interesting discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That'll do it for WSFI Spotlight. For John Breen, I'm AJ Shaw.
This has been WSFI Spotlight. For more information on this or any other program, email info@wsfiradio.org.
Thank you for listening to another edition of WQPH's Local Matters. We hope you enjoyed the broadcast and hope you have a blessed week.